Has an invisible small detail ever completely changed the course of a case? This happened to me, and believe me, I never imagined that a simple piece of paper could unmask a truth no one expected. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. I'm Dr. Fernando Suarez, a forensic doctor here in Quito, Ecuador, and today I want to tell you about the most unexpected and revealing case I've had to investigate in my 15 years working in this profession. A story that reminded me that the truth is often hidden in the smallest things. It all started one early morning when we received the body of a man around 70 years old. They brought him in quietly, without dramatic scenes or obvious signs of violence or accident. At first glance, a routine case, something to catch a little sleep before the next shift. But something in my instinct told me it wasn't that simple. While carefully checking his belongings, my eye stopped on a small, crumpled piece of paper in his jacket. It could have easily gone unnoticed, but something pushed me to open it and read it. What I found on that little piece of paper completely changed the story everyone believed. What seemed like just another case turned into a complicated and, above all, human mystery. A story where silence and the invisible spoke louder than any wound. In this narrative, I want you to join me step by step, so you can understand how patience, observation, and attention to the smallest details can be the key to revealing a truth no one expected. Now, come with me to discover what was hidden in that small piece of paper and how we face the unexpected in the Quito morgue. Because here, on the border between life and death, every detail matters, and sometimes, just sometimes, a small piece of paper can change everything. I only want the content of the text translated. Without any explanation or indication, I remember that day exactly, how the silence in the autopsy room seemed heavier than usual. A body had arrived, that of an elderly man, for whom no obvious cause of death was apparent at first glance. Nothing broken, no bruises, no external wounds indicating an accident or violence. Those kinds of cases are usually more complicated because they require looking beyond, searching for the invisible, what others might overlook. As I began the external examination, I took note of the clothes he was wearing, the overall condition of the body, but one of those small details caught my attention. A small crumpled piece of paper in the pocket of his shirt. Nothing extraordinary to anyone else, but something inside me told me it was worth looking at carefully. I took it out carefully, try not to damage it, and unfolded it slowly. It was a crumpled, yellowed paper from age, with handwritten letters. That simple action was the unexpected twist that started everything. What was on that paper was neither an innocent note nor a common message. It was a series of names, dates, and some numbers that, at first glance, seemed confusing, but when read calmly and with attention to detail, began to tell a hidden story. I still did not understand what relationship that small scrap of paper could have with his death, but it was clear that something had been revealed to me at that moment. It was a strange feeling between intuition and certainty that made my mind spin quickly in search of answers. My days in the morgue had always been marked by evident cases, where the cause of death was clear and the procedure sometimes almost routine. But that paper broke all that linearity. I took photos of the paper, preserved it in a sterile bag, and decided that not only the physical autopsy was important, but also understanding what that hidden clue meant. With this new path, I began to review the documentation that arrived with the body, looking for matches, but I also started searching other medical files, social reports, and even police data, piecing together invisible parts that increased the suspicion that this elderly man, whose death seemed natural, might have been involved in something deeper, perhaps secret, or even a situation no one wanted to see before. After spending hours upon hours analyzing, every detail of the paper began to take shape in my mind. The names were real people, some linked to recent cases in the city, reported disappearances, conflicts that seemed unrelated but, when viewed from a distance, appeared to fit into the same puzzle. It was not just a random list, but a record that someone had consciously kept. Maybe the man himself, maybe someone else who wanted to leave a message. The physical autopsy revealed something that also made me hesitate. The cause of death was not as clear as it seemed. There were internal signs pointing to a slow, almost imperceptible poisoning that could have gone unnoticed without a thorough examination. That made me think of possible poisoning, discreet and well-planned, going against appearances. Here, the small paper began to turn into a kind of manual or key I needed to interpret to understand who would want to harm him and why. It was then I decided to interview people close to the man. Family, neighbors, even colleagues from that supposed network suggested by the paper. As I progressed through those interviews, I encountered silences, evasive looks, and contradictions that only increased the tension of the case. Some people confirmed the man had received threats. Others said they knew nothing. But the truth was no one denied the existence of problems beyond the obvious. What impressed me most was the contradiction between the apparent calm of an elderly man and the silent storm surrounding him. The idea that in his own life, in the shadows, he carried a burden no one wanted to confront. Understanding that, feeling that reality so close, is something few can explain. For me, it meant also understanding the vulnerabilities that sometimes accompany those who appear strong on the outside. While developing the case, I felt the pressure of time and the obligation not to leave any stone unturned. I found myself reviewing old documents, searching for connections, holding conversations that seemed to lead nowhere, and sometimes questioning whether I was letting my imagination run wild. But the paper did not lie. It was a silent testimony that had been there all along, waiting to be discovered. One night, revisiting those dates and names written in ink that seemed to slip away with the passing years, I noticed something that had gone unnoticed until then. A pattern among them, dates that coincided with important events not only affecting the man before me, but an entire network of people who, in their daily lives, moved between legality and danger. This transformed the case from a simple forensic examination into a much more complex and dangerous investigation. I even involved the authorities discreetly to protect confidentiality and the progress of the process, because I knew that if that information fell into the wrong hands, it could put not only the investigation but human lives at risk. Life behind death can be as fragile as it is intense, and I was touching something so delicate that it required the utmost care. Every day I advanced, I felt as if I was carrying an unknown world in my hands, a labyrinth where each piece was a buried truth. But I also felt something stronger, the responsibility not to let it be forgotten, to make the invisible visible, and to understand that that small piece of paper was the key someone used to tell a story that should not remain hidden. Never before had I felt so clearly how a simple detail could transform a life, even after death. That connection between the paper and the body became a call to look beyond appearances, to cultivate patience and observation, and to give voice to the silent secrets. It was a painful but necessary reminder that in forensic work, as in life itself, nothing is set in stone, and sometimes the truth lives in the smallest and most forgotten corners. That case became for me more than a procedure. It became a lesson I carry in my soul, where the value of observation, perseverance, and sensitivity emerged to show me what it really means to unravel a human story. Although I thought it was a common death, I realized I had witnessed something much deeper, a truth that could change the fate of many, and it all began with a crumpled piece of paper in a pocket. And as I continue telling this story, I still feel in my chest that mixture of awe and respect for what silence and small details can hide, always reminded me that my work is not just science, but a bridge to understand what many do not see at first glance. What happened after discovering that pattern on the paper took me by surprise, although I was certain that small piece of paper was not there by chance. As I delved deeper into connections, I noticed that several of those names belonged to people who apparently had no direct link to each other, but they did share common points. Some were witnesses in legal cases, others had suffered extortion, and a few were known for disputes in local businesses that seemed ordinary on the surface, but, upon closer examination, revealed a much more complex web. There was something that tied all those circumstances together, like an invisible network that most preferred not to see. I remember feeling a knot in my stomach when I contacted the first relative of the deceased. The call was tense, filled with suspicion, but I wanted to understand if anyone else had noticed any strange behavior in the weeks before his death. The response was not immediate. There were silences, then cautious words, phrases that seemed to want to hide more than they revealed. I realized I was not just dealing with a forensic medicine case, but had also plunged into an emotional web that touched the deepest parts of those who knew that man. What until then seemed like just a possible poisoning became clearer when in toxicology reports returned results confirming the presence of a rare substance, not usually detected in such cases. It was a slow, subtle, nearly imperceptible poison that had begun to act days before the man died. A type of toxin that metabolized and disappeared quickly on its own, unless very specific tests were done, like those required for this case. This made me suspect that whoever was behind it had quite advanced knowledge, someone who knew how to remain unnoticed in forensic terms. With this new information, I shifted the investigation toward a possible homicide, but not a common homicide, rather one planned in shadows, requiring patience and knowledge of the man's environment to understand who, how, and why. I returned to the paper, studied it under a magnifying glass, compared the handwriting, and tried to find small details that might give me clues about its authorship, but the ink was already somewhat blurred and the writing, although clear, did not help identify anyone specific. However, the coincidence of that list with several pending cases in the city began to make sense. The victim was somehow a link between those events, or at least had been. Talking to some police officers handling related cases, I sensed fear, as if that paper, and especially what it implied, was more dangerous than it seemed. But no one wanted to speak openly about it. Some warned me to stop digging too much, that some secrets were better kept under lock and key. That only increased my curiosity and the feeling that I was on the right path. Although at the same time, it made me aware that I was stepping into a territory where the truth could be much harsher than I expected. Then, a woman showed up at my door unannounced. Someone close to the victim. She had heard about my investigation and wanted to share something she hadn't told the police or anyone else. Her eyes were full of fear, but also determination. She told me that in his last months, the man had been talking about certain people and events that worried him, but he hadn't wanted to give details for fear of reprisals. She had the impression that those threats were not empty, that indeed someone wanted to harm him, something he had tried to keep secret to protect his loved ones. This confession placed me in a doubly difficult position. On one hand, I had to protect that information because it could change many things. On the other, the urgency to unravel had to go hand in hand with my medical and legal responsibility. I knew that any mistake could ruin the investigation or put innocent people at risk. So I decided to proceed cautiously, gathering every fragment of information as if it were an indispensable piece to complete a puzzle that, if assembled incorrectly, could shatter into 1,000 pieces. The atmosphere around me began to take on a darker tone. In the morgue, in conversations, even in the streets where the man had lived, I felt something was changing. Suspicion ceased to be just a part of my job and started to become personal. Many times, after long days, I found myself thinking about that paper, mentally reviewing each name, convinced that silence was not an option. I had begun to give that paper a kind of symbolic power. It was not just a document. It was a silent testament of someone who, in some way, wanted to leave a mark, a truth, despite the danger. One of the most difficult nights was when I received an anonymous call. There were no specific words, just a faint but clear warning. Stop looking or you'll regret it. I hung up not knowing whether to laugh, worry, or feel the chill that ran down my spine. At that moment, I understood that this investigation was touching a sensitive nerve, that it had transcended the professional to become something much darker and more dangerous. Nevertheless, the pressure did not stop me. On the contrary, with renewed energy, I dedicated myself to diving deeper into the human network that paper hinted at. I discovered that the man had been indirectly involved in a conflict involving illicit businesses, powerful people, and well-kept secrets. None of this was easy to prove, much less confront. But every little clue gathered, every detail left to chance or ignored by others, began to form part of a narrative that was not yet finished, that begged to be told before it was lost forever. One of those days, while reviewing files and documents, a coincidence shook me. One of the names on the list was linked to a recent unresolved event whose victim was still missing. He lived in the same area where the man had died. This opened an unexpected door. Perhaps the paper was not only a testimony of the past, but a key to preventing something that could still be avoided. With this in mind, I decided to seek out some of those named on the list. My first visit was to a small establishment, a cafe in a modest neighborhood of Quito, where I learned one of the names frequented. There, the person I spoke to reacted with distrust, almost fear. They did not deny a connection to the deceased, but their words were careful, avoiding giving too many details. It was evident that behind that facade, there was more than was being said. Still, every conversation gave me clues, although often they seemed like scattered fragments, as if someone had taken care to erase key parts of the story. What became increasingly clear was that the man had been trying to warn, or perhaps denounce from his vulnerable position, a series of events that could put many people at risk. The paper, then, took on an even more powerful meaning for me. It was a message of urgency and warning that perhaps no one understood until it was too late. As I pieced the puzzle together, I understood that the line between victim and witness was very thin. He had not only been affected, but had taken into his hands something that probably cost him his life. That paper not only summarized a hidden reality, but was the key to giving voice to the violent silences lived by that community. Every step I took moved me away from an easy closure and closer to a truth that was not in a single name or a single date, but in the very fabric of society that protected itself with secrets and fear. The weight of that knowledge began to feel heavier on my shoulders, but also more necessary. At that moment, I understood that my role was much more than a forensic doctor. I had to become the guardian of that truth, the messenger of those who could no longer speak. The case changed my perspective forever. I learned that a wrinkled piece of paper, forgotten in a pocket, could hold a memory and voice an entire life, and that to discover what really happened, you must be willing to listen, to wait, and to face the darkness that sometimes hides behind an apparently simple death. As I continue working and sharing the story, I want you to understand that the truth is not always in the autopsy, in the medical detail, or in the most obvious evidence. Sometimes the truth lies in what no one wants to look at, in the small things that seem insignificant, but that nevertheless hold the key to understanding what really happened. That day with the paper not only finally made sense of that man's death, but launched me on a journey that is still not over, a path where every detail counts, where patience is essential, and where observation becomes a light that can illuminate even the darkest secrets. That is why every time I find something small, almost invisible, I know I must stop, observe, and listen to what that piece wants to tell me. Because sometimes in the silence of a body, in a minimal sign, in a forgotten piece of paper, lives a truth that can change everything. And that is the ultimate value of my work. Not letting those truths be lost, but making them visible, so that memory lives beyond a final silence. Days passed, and my obsession with that list only continued to grow. Every time I thought I had a firm link, something happened that made me step back or showed me that not everything was so linear or simple. The deeper I delved, the further I moved away from the straightforward field of forensic medicine to immerse myself in a tangle of conflicting interests, forced silences, and fears that seemed faceless but held great influence. I especially remember the night I returned to Morgue to review the samples again. It wasn't a usual practice, but something in my instinct told me I had to do it. The substance identified in the toxicology report, that subtle and fleeting poison, had completely disappeared from the blood in the initial tests. However, something caught my attention, a small fragment attached to the gastric tissue which, when analyzed under a more powerful microscope, revealed microscopic traces of a strange compound, an agrochemical uncommon in the city, mainly used in certain crops outside Quito. That piece didn't fit the version that had been circulated so far, and that discrepancy led me to propose an even more unsettling hypothesis. What if the man had not only been deliberately poisoned, but had also recently been in contact with someone or something related to agricultural areas or work of those characteristics? With that idea in mind, I started discreetly asking about his daily life, his movements. Thanks to an anonymous source who had dared to speak, whether out of fear or conviction, I did not know, I discovered that the man had been involved in corruption, complaints related to the management of lands and agricultural products in the region, a matter loaded with interest for powerful groups who prefer to remain in the shadows. Although it seemed strange at first glance, everything began to make sense. The substance used, the slow poison, and that network of people who apparently shared nothing but a past marked by shady business and veiled threats. I cannot deny that each advance forced me to carefully consider who I could trust. I felt the weight of professional solitude, but also the commitment to keep going. There was something about that struggle, in the pursuit of justice beyond the corpse, that became a driving force for me. It was not just another death. It was a sign that many other truths remained buried, and my job was, at least, to try to bring them to light. One afternoon, I received an unexpected invitation to meet with a detective who had been working on related cases. Despite initial reluctance, I accepted. In a discreet cafe, in a corner where few could hear, he handed me a file with photographs, press clippings, and testimonies that confirmed the victim was not just a passive witness, but had tried to alert certain authorities about irregularities that put him on the radar of dangerous people. The most disturbing part was that one of the names on the list was connected to a recent incident of enforced disappearance, just weeks before the man's death, which remained unresolved. That conversation completely changed my perspective. I was no longer just processing the remains of a body, but linking lives, stories, and secrets that resisted coming to light. I realized that the paper was effectively a grimoire of signs, a roadmap to understanding a web involving corruption, fear, and systemic violence, and which I also sensed could put more people at risk if not handled with sufficient caution. That's how I decided the next stage was crucial, to talk with more relatives of those on the list, but do so discreetly, earning their trust. I knew any misstep could close many doors. The first to confide in me was a woman in her 30s, a cousin of one of the most recurrent names on the paper. We met in a quiet park, away from the city noise, where the wind seemed to want to carry away the words sweating from her lips. What she told me was heartbreaking. Increasing threats, extortion, and a palpable fear that invaded the entire family, a fear that had thwarted complaints and left wounds no one wanted to openly discuss. She spoke of a network of influence that was not only economic, but had touched several productive sectors, from the night trade to municipal works. That network was intertwined with figures who, although public, maintained an impeccable facade while clandestine acts were committed with chilling impunity. What impressed me was that all this information was not theory but tangible evidence no one had dared to collect or show. I sensed in her words a mix of resignation and quiet courage that deeply moved me. As I kept gathering those pieces, I felt I was beginning to lose control over the emotional impact of the situation. The pressure grew, along with the feeling that I was in a race against an invisible enemy. I found myself increasingly absorbing stories full of pain, unaccounted losses, and a system seemingly designed to protect those who held power rather than the real victims. With every story, every testimony, I understood more that the profession to which I had dedicated years was much more than anatomy and science. It was humanity, it was courage, but also a battle against indifference and manipulation. I couldn't stop thinking about that man. How alone he must have felt trying to share the truth, to try to make someone listen before it was too late. One night, after a long day, I received a direct and cryptic message on my phone. "We know what you're looking for. Don't trust anyone outside." The purpose was clear. The threat returned closer, more tangible. I felt the cold of reality hitting the back of my neck. Those kinds of warnings don't come to just anyone, let alone someone who simply does their job. But instead of retreating, that call was an incentive to double my efforts. I then decided to confidentially consult experts in criminology and security to better understand the scope of what I was facing. The conversations were illuminating. They explained that what seemed like an isolated case was actually part of a pattern where key people disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances, and where corruption permeated multiple levels, from bureaucracy to law enforcement. Understanding that context was essential to protect not only the investigation, but my own integrity. But it wasn't just a professional matter demanding my vigilance. I noticed subtle and worrying signs near my personal environment. Some nights, I felt the impression of being watched. Cars seemed to follow me for no reason. Mysterious calls at odd hours with no one on the other end. Many might call it paranoia, but those of us close to certain cases learn these feelings are not coincidental. However, there was an internal force stronger than fear, duty, a sense of justice that prevented me from giving up. That's why one morning, I gathered all the material I had been able to collect to present a preliminary report to a prosecutor's office that, although not perfect, showed more openness than others. It was a delicate but necessary step to seek institutional support and prevent that truth from being lost in the labyrinth of omission. By sharing even small parts of that hidden network, I witnessed reactions that confirmed I was touching a sensitive nerve. Interest, surprise, discomfort. But I also obtained concrete responses. A broader investigation was launched involving other agencies, other specialists, and they promised protection for those willing to collaborate. It was a small ray of hope amid so much darkness. At the same time, I became aware that I couldn't continue this path alone. I began to build networks with civil organizations and journalists who shared my interest in exposing those silenced truths. There, away from the official noise, I found strong and committed voices that helped me understand that my effort was part of a greater process, a movement seeking to dignify the memory of those left behind without justice. The most beautiful and harsh thing at the same time was seeing how, despite threats and fear, stories of solidarity among affected communities emerged. Tales of people supporting each other, so as not to be carried away by apathy or terror. I understood that although the system had deep flaws, real strength resided in every individual who refused to be complicit in silence. That conviction changed my approach. I was no longer just analyzing bodies. Now I listened to lives. Every medical fact, every pattern, transformed into a human narrative, and that made my work infinitely more complex but also more meaningful. I began documenting not only physical evidence, but also those voices, so that the paper found would no longer be just an anonymous list, but become a symbol of resistance and memory. Amid that emotional roller coaster, a new piece of the puzzle emerged. Recordings intercepted in a neighboring case, where conversations seemed to confirm the existence of that hidden network, with direct mentions of the people on the paper. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was strong enough to assert that something big was happening and that the victim had paid a high price for trying to unravel it. When I put those recordings in the hands of the responsible authorities, I felt a mix of relief and fear. I knew the road was still long, that the truth would not cease until every name, every story, had a response. But I also understood that this stage was fundamental to consolidate the case, so it would not become a forgotten whisper, but a cry demanding justice. With all that weight on me, I returned to Morgue, to that place where it all began. I looked again at that small piece of paper, now under new light, with a gaze full of respect and recognition. That paper had been much more than an object. It had been a beacon in the darkness, a sign that even in death there are invisible threads connecting people, their fears, their struggles. I understood that although my work seemed behind the scenes, it was part of a chain of values and actions that could transform realities. Being a forensic specialist doesn't only mean making post-mortem diagnoses, but giving voice to those who have none, opening doors others want sealed, and witnessing truth even when it hurts. It is likely that the case does not yet have a clear ending, and perhaps never will in the way I would want. But the most valuable thing I learned is that every detail, no matter how small, can be the catalyst for a silent revolution. That commitment to the truth involves risks, doubts, and sleepless nights, but also the certainty that the effort is worth it. So, as I walk the streets of Quito, eyes alert to what others don't see, I carry with me not only medical knowledge, but a conviction that my role is to be the guardian of those stories demanding to be heard. Because after all, justice and memory are built with patience, careful observation, and the courage not to give in to darkness. I still keep that crumpled note on my desk, not as a reminder of a closed case, but as proof that truth dwells in the most unexpected places, in seemingly insignificant things. That sometimes a small piece of paper can be the beginning of a chain of discoveries that teach us more about humanity than any other analysis. And although that man's story became much more complex and painful than I imagined, I know his silent last word was to hand me that key, a call to not let his words and those of others be lost to oblivion. It has undoubtedly been my most unexpected case, and also the most revealing. Death is not always the end, but sometimes the beginning of a truth worth telling. The truth is that from that moment on, everything took on a speed that, although it seemed to move slowly, consumed me more and more with each step I took. I received calls that I didn't answer, messages that I ignored, and glances that tried to see through the walls of my office without me noticing. The tension grew little by little, almost imperceptibly, like a silent poison that cannot be seen but can be felt. There was violence in the air, a dark pressure that seemed to guard the silence others wished to keep intact. One afternoon I decided to take a leap and show up in person in the agricultural area I had heard so much about, but had only known through documents and testimonies until then. I wanted to understand firsthand what kind of environment had surrounded that man, how that context was lived, one that had ended up marking his fate. Arriving there was like entering another world. The landscape was beautiful, But there was something beneath that apparent tranquility that generated an indescribable unease. Distrustful looks, conversations interrupted when I approached, all indicated that the web of fear was extensive and solid. I walked through the fields, spoke with some workers and neighbors, tried not to seem too inquisitive, just a curious visitor trying to learn the truth. But the truth I reached was neither simple nor clear. I learned about files, buried papers, payments, and favors that moved like invisible threads. They showed me photos, blurred documents, but there was no hand willing to give me something definitive without first looking away, without first casting a quick glance at the horizon, as if asking whether anyone was watching them. Each piece seemed tied not only to economic interests, but to tragic personal stories and a silent fear that seemed to pollute the air. It was during one of those walks that an older man, whether by sun and hard work, cautiously approached me. He did not reveal his name, but his low, grave voice seemed to carry centuries of warning. He told me that place knew more about shadows and light, that corruption was not only in papers or offices, it was in the land itself, in decisions made drop by drop that affected lives for generations. He told me that the victim, the man I had examined, had been a key figure in a complaint that never saw the official light, that his death, for many, had not been an accident nor a simple medical case, but a direct message. That conversation left me breathless, a mix of unease and admiration for the courage of someone who, with few words, described a world far more complex and dark than I had imagined. At that moment, I confirmed that my suspicions were on the right track, that the case I initially considered medical mystery had become an intricate human story connected to an almost impenetrable system. But far from discouraging me, that talk ignited a flame in me that I could no longer extinguish. The need to bring that truth to light, no matter the cost. Back in Quito, I began consolidating all the information I was collecting, not only medical data from the case, but also testimonies, documents, photos, audios, everything that could give body to the hidden story behind the death. I knew that if something went wrong, that effort could amount to nothing. But I also understood that risk was necessary because justice is not only based on scientific evidence, but on courage and conviction. In the midst of that work, one early morning, I received an anonymous email with an attached file. It was a video recorded from afar, a hidden camera in one of the properties in the agricultural zone. In the video, a group of men could be seen talking, fully aware of a plan involving several actors who appeared on the crumpled paper I had found in the deceased man's pocket. Hearing those voices, knowing that behind the words there were concrete decisions, made me feel the real weight of the violence hiding beneath the surface. It was not just theory. It was action, palpable fear, complicity with death. I shared this material with contacts I had started to form in the prosecutor's office and with some independent journalists. The response was immediate and coordinated. We started organizing a plan to give visibility to the case without risking the sources or those collaborating. Secrecy became our ally as we wove a network that could bear the weight of the investigation without collapsing. But the pressure also rose a notch. My routine changed. I began noticing unfamiliar cars near my house, calls with no answer on the other end of the phone, coded messages I didn't fully understand but that foretold something ominous. That was when I knew I was not alone, that the web I had uncovered had eyes everywhere, and that any mistake could cost me greatly, not only professionally but personally. What had once been a vague sense of threat turned into a clear warning. My life was beginning to be in danger. I then decided to take precautions. I reduced my outings, kept every step I took with maximum confidentiality, and began sharing only essential information with a few key people. Despite the fear, that determination strengthened me. I knew the path was uncertain, but giving up meant leaving many in the dark. The commitment I had taken on was so intense that it excluded any surrender. On one of those dark days, when doubts and exhaustion weighed heavier than ever, I received an unexpected message from a woman who confided details about the Influence Network. She asked urgently to meet to tell me something new. We met in a discreet place, a secluded cafe, away from curious eyes. There, with a trembling but determined voice, she handed me a folder with documents proving financial and political contacts directly linked to land manipulation and the systematic cover-up of related crimes. It was the evidence we needed to solidify a strong complaint. That delivery filled me with a mix of hope and concern. We had in our hands elements that could topple powerful figures, but we also knew that releasing those proofs without a secure plan could unleash reprisals. That's why we began coordinating with human rights defenders and witness protection groups. The case's scope was growing rapidly, and with it, the responsibility of each of us. I cannot deny that there were nights when exhaustion overcame me, when anguish made my mind linger on the victim's closed eyes, trying to find his last unwritten words, trying to understand what more I could do to honor his struggle. But each dawn brought renewed certainty that death had marked a before and after, not only in my career, but in how I saw the world and justice. What seemed simple, a crumpled piece of paper in a pocket, had become the key to a puzzle spanning generations and exposing the darkest guts of reality many would prefer to ignore. And amid that labyrinth, I sensed that, regardless of threats or imposed silences, there was a greater force driving us. The desire for truth and respect for those who, like that man, had chosen to face the darkness, even at the height of their vulnerability. So here I am today, at that point where the investigation has taken on a life of its own, where each testimony adds another thread to this infinite web of pending justice. And I know the path is not over, that there are still chapters to write, voices to hear, and shadows to disperse. But I also know something essential, that as long as someone is willing to seek the truth, even blindly, there will always be light at the end of the tunnel. Because, after all, the small piece of paper I found is much more than an object. It is a powerful reminder that in every corner, in every nearly imperceptible detail, lies a story that deserves to be told. And in this story, as in so many others, the truth, painful and twisted as it may be, is the only path to freedom, to justice, and finally to hope. From that meeting in the cafe onward, everything became a delicate balance between moving forward and staying safe. Every new piece of information that came into my hands was a puzzle piece fitting with others, but it was also another risk that had to be managed carefully. It wasn't just about gathering evidence, but about understanding that behind those documents were lives at stake, and that one wrong move could mean the shadows I knew so well closing tightly around us. I was forced to expand my circle of trust, but always with an eye on those who could accompany us without jeopardizing what had been built. Together with human rights defenders, we designed a strategy to filter information securely, using protected channels and avoiding any unnecessary exposure. The journalists, for their part, were responsible for verifying every detail with independent sources, preparing the ground for a public denunciation that we hoped would not be forgotten. During that process, something curious began to happen. Some pieces that seemed unrelated started to show patterns pointing beyond the figures we initially believed involved. It was like discovering that a map, previously only marked with main routes, now revealed secondary roads and hidden tunnels. There were more actors, more interests, and more motives, all intertwined in a network that seemed impossible to unravel without titanic effort. One of those unexpected twists came when I received an encrypted message from an anonymous contact in the agricultural zone. They informed me that one of the key witnesses had disappeared, last seen under unclear circumstances. It was a gut punch that reminded me how fragile this struggle was. Fear seeped into every corner. These were not vague threats or conspiracy theories, but concrete facts carried out under the cover of night. With every step, I began to feel I was entering a territory where justice was almost a forbidden word, an ideal some wanted to bury. But it was precisely that perception that strengthened my resolve. I thought of that elderly man whose death had come to light because of a crumpled piece of paper and the silent message his disappearance represented. I must not let that sacrifice be in vain. Pressure, both outside and within my work, grew exponentially. At the morgue, routine became a momentary pause, a temporary refuge to organize my thought among bodies that, though cold, spoke of realities rarely admitted so openly. There, in that space filled with silence and absence, I reflected on the many secrets a simple body could reveal if someone was truly willing to listen. There were nights when loneliness became unbearable. Encrypted messages sometimes gave way to more direct threats, voices on the other end of the phone promising consequences if I did not stop my search. One night, as heavy rain fell over Quito, I felt the presence of someone watching from the street, a stranger who disappeared as soon as I noticed. It was a brief moment, but its meaning was clear. I was not alone, and there were those who wanted me to stop. However, there were also unexpected gestures of solidarity. Some peasants who had initially looked at me with suspicion began to open up slowly, confident that someone from outside was applying pressure to bring the truth to light. Stories that seemed like scattered fragments began to converge. Accounts of past and present injustices, small acts of resistance, contrasting with the dark among so many pieces. I particularly remember a conversation with a young woman who worked at an agricultural cooperative. Her eyes reflected the weariness of someone who had seen a lot, but also it contained hope. She told me about a plot of land that was to be handed over to a foreign company, a deal that was almost complete but lacked real community support. That land was, according to her, one of the main points of conflict, the crown jewel behind many of the shady decisions we had uncovered. What she told me confirmed something I had begun to suspect. This case was not just a matter of isolated corruption or abuse of power, but part of a structural phenomenon that had impacted the region for decades. Land seized, resources exploited without control, displaced communities, and a system fiercely protecting those who benefited from that exploitation. The paper found in the deceased man's pocket was just a glimmer in an ocean of injustices. One day I received an additional forensic report, prepared with equipment I had discreetly requested, which shed new light on the circumstances of the victim's death. The analysis revealed traces of substances not expected in the deceased's usual environment, compounds that could be related to a type of slow and silent poisoning. This opened a window in another direction, one pointing not just an accident or direct intervention, but to a more sophisticated and cruel modus operandi. I tried to confront this new information with some witnesses, but the response was again a wall of silence and fear. Some even feared that merely knowing the facts put them at immediate risk. I understood that this conspiracy was not only handled politically or economically, but extended to social control through veiled threats, disinformation, and tacit imposition of power. The deeper I immersed myself in this plot, the more aware I became that I was challenging a system that thrived on keeping those secrets safe. But I also understood that those secrets had cracks, places where light could seep in, and that was where I had to focus, in those invisible cracks to those who were not truly seeking to uncover. The small, crumpled piece of paper, which at first seemed like a forgotten detail, was becoming the door to those cracks. I was overcome by a sense of responsibility, weighing heavily on my shoulders, yet at the same time an unstoppable driving force. I couldn't let silence win, nor the community I now knew and who had entrusted me with their fears and hopes become just another victim. I knew the path was long, involved real danger and personal strain, but that this battle was, at its core, human and necessary. Amid the scenario, one of my contacts in the prosecutor's office warned me that the situation was becoming critical. Rumors of sabotage to the investigation, attempts to discredit linked journalists, and possible maneuvers to interfere with witness protection measures. The fragile web we had woven trembled, demanding now more than ever strength and a joint plan to ensure that all this struggle would not be lost in darkness. That is why, without lowering my guard, we began preparing everything for the public denunciation we knew would strike directly at powerful interests. The afternoon before making it official, I reviewed once more every document, every video, every audio we had gathered. I calmly held that crumpled paper again, feeling its texture between my fingers and sensing its weight. I remembered the elderly man, his silent fight, and understood that something greater ran through me. It was not just my search, but that of many others in that land and in all corners where truth hides behind imposed silence. When everything was in the hands of justice and society, I knew there would be consequences, that it would not end with a single act of bravery, but with a chain of efforts that had to remain steadfast. But I also knew that without that first step, nothing could change. The light we sought was not a fleeting glimmer of hope, but a constant flame that, though small, could dispel the darkest shadows. I remember myself in those moments, with the mixture of fear and conviction that only someone facing human complexity directly can understand. Every word, every gesture, every detail was a form of resistance, and although the future was uncertain, one certainty accompanied me. As long as that pulse for truth continued, nothing could extinguish the light born from a simple crumpled paper in a pocket, a paper that, unknowingly, changed everything. Weeks passed, and with them, reality became increasingly dense and pressing. It was not only the uncertainty that crept into every corner, but the constant presence of shadow that seemed to anticipate every move and response we tried to make. Everything in that environment seemed to live under the invisible threat of an impassive watcher. At times, I felt as if the city itself whispered secrets to me, and I was nothing more than an intruder trying to decipher a language that few could still understand. The daily monotony at the morgue contrasted with the silent effervescence I experienced outside those walls, where every piece of information, every conversation, meant the difference between moving forward or stepping back. Days turned into sleepless nights, not so much due to physical exhaustion, but because my mind refused to stop, analyzing every word received, every gesture shared with interlocutors aware that a single misstep could destroy what we had so painstakingly achieved. Trust was not easy, not even among those who seemed to raise their voices for justice. I often wondered how many of those faces were true allies, and how many were pieces in a far more twisted game. The crumpled paper that had started it all was increasingly becoming the compass that guided me, but also the target of those who wanted that light never to see the surface. On one of those endless nights, I remember the precise feeling of silence just before everything began to collapse. I received disturbing news. One of the bravest journalists supporting us had been the victim of an attempted assault. The subtle yet firm way intimidation was sought highlighted how delicate our position was. That attack did not only aim to stop a denunciation, but intended to instill fear, a paralyzing fear that often silences forever. However, rather than frightening us, it was an urgent call to redouble efforts, to sharpen security measures, and to strengthen the human network that, delicate and weak, sustained as half-exposed truth. Tension became a constant element in my work, and although I maintained composure in front of the bodies arriving at the morgue, I knew that outside, in reality, hot blood ran through desperate hands trying to keep the secrets where they were. One day, while reviewing reports with a group of human rights defenders, an unexpected leak shook the already fragile structure we had built. Compromising documents related to land transfers began circulating not only in legal circles, but also on social networks and alternative media. The accuracy and level of detail in material shook the foundations of several power circles, putting on high alert those who until then had operated with impunity. Nevertheless, that disclosure also generated an unexpected effect. Some communities that until then had remained silent or resigned began to raise their voices, not in large protests, but in small acts of reclamation, in nighttime meetings by candlelight, in murmurs that gradually became a collective chorus. I felt that the truth began to permeate among ordinary people, that it was no longer just my story or that of a few, but a narrative shared by the very protagonists of this history. Hope, faint but persistent, started to emerge from that small, crumpled paper and claim a space for itself. However, the storm was far from subsiding. With each advancement in the investigation, the responses we received from the prosecutor's office were elusive and at times frankly evasive. Some officials seemed more interested in preserving the status quo than in administering justice. I soon understood that the conflict permeated all levels, from corruption in public institutions to the covert pressure exerted by multinational companies with million-dollar interests in that agricultural region. That network, woven with invisible threads fed by power and fear, represented a much greater challenge than the initial discovery of a piece of paper in a pocket. It was amidst that whirlwind that I received one of the messages that weighed most heavily on my conscience. A witness who had decided to speak was missing, and their family feared something grave had happened to them. The mere thought of that outcome paralyzed me, but also reaffirmed the urgency of making justice tangible, which still seemed distant. I could not allow the words to be lost in the void, or the sacrifice of those who dared to reveal the truth to vanish in impunity. I decided to contact that missing person to the last people who had seen them, and although the information was fragmented and confusing, I felt that a new piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. The search for the missing witness led me down paths I had not previously considered. I ventured into rural communities where distrust of authority was palpable. On those journeys, living conditions were harsh, and silence was often the only defense. The stories I heard about forced displacements, indiscriminate fumigations, and disappearances intertwined with the story of the old man and his crumpled paper, which no longer seemed a mere coincidence, but a symbol of silent resistance. That emerging coherence was unsettling and powerful at the same time. In one of those villages, someone told me about an elderly man who months earlier had tried to alert others to irregularities and who had ended up subjected to a campaign of cultural and social discredit. That account not only reflected the implicit violence of the system, but confirmed a painful truth. In the struggle for land and dignity, history repeated itself over and over, with actors changing roles, but a script that kept its corrupt core intact. It was a moment when I felt the weight not only of investigating a case, but of exposing a structure that seemed petrified in time. That night, back in Quito, I found it hard to sleep. The face of the elderly man in the community and that of the deceased old man intertwined in my mind. How many stories like those have been buried under official silence? How many voices have been drowned before reaching the light? Each of those questions propelled me forward, but also made clear that the battle unfolding was much more than a mere forensic file. It was a fight for justice, memory, and dignity. Meanwhile, the threats did not relent. I began to notice movements difficult to explain, vehicles appearing immediately after my movements, people I saw repeatedly in different places, anonymous calls with prolonged silences, and the constant fear that any day, everything could vanish in an instant. That was when I understood that this search could cost me more than just peace of mind, that I was touching strings so powerful that even my own life was at risk. But giving up was never an option. One day, a close contact handed me a folder with documents that seemed key to unequivocally unraveling the links between some authorities and the companies involved. There were contracts, emails, and testimonies that left no room for doubt. However, as I progressed in reading, I also felt a dizzying sensation difficult to explain. It was not just the scope of the network uncovered, but the certainty that revealing that entire framework would mean naming monsters few wanted to face. The information was powerful, but also extremely delicate. Together with other colleagues and legal defenders, we began planning how to make that information reach the public without putting those who trusted us at risk. We analyzed the possibility of creating a secure platform to share evidence that would allow other independent media to join the cause while protecting sensitive data. The idea was that the public denunciation would not be an isolated heroic act, but the start a chain of demands and claims that would truly consolidate the struggle. But just when it seemed that the path was somewhat clearer, reality struck me with another surprise. Someone had altered the original forensic report on the old man's death. It was not a mistake, but clear manipulation intended to divert the cause toward a common accident, erasing any connection to poisoning or the slow and silent intoxication we had detected. That sabotage led me to question not only the integrity of the institutions involved, but the depth of the problem we faced. There were no limits to what some were willing to do to keep the truth from coming to light. In the midst of that storm, an unexpected ally appeared. A young prosecutor who decided to take the reins of the case and who, with courage and conviction, began openly challenging the pressures from her superiors. Her support was crucial in reopening investigations and protecting key witnesses, and she showed me that even in the most discredited institutions, there can be spaces for ethics and justice. Together we began to devise new strategies, aware that every step had to be calculated and firm. The situation also became a scenario where technology and social activism played a crucial role. Social networks, awareness campaigns, and massive denunciations began to mobilize public opinion, making it harder for dark maneuvers to continue invisibly. I was impressed by the power of an informed and committed society and how the small crumpled paper I had found that day had become a symbol capable of mobilizing wills and igniting a spark that could change the fate of many communities. But the battle did not end there. As public denunciations gained ground, the reprisals intensified. Not only threats, but personal discredit campaigns, misinformation, and constant pressure to discredit our sources. The strategy of those who preferred silence became increasingly aggressive, trying to extinguish the flame we had managed to light. However, that darkness could not hide the faces of those who, from the margins, bore witness and kept alive the demand for justice. In those moments, when the struggle seemed endless and moral weariness threatened to break me, I remember the old man, his crumpled paper, and all the voices that had entrusted me with their truths with fear, but also with hope. I understood that the flame I carried was stronger than any darkness. No conspiracy, No threat could extinguish the human when nourished by the relentless pursuit of truth. I also knew that this story would not end with a single report or denunciation, but would open the door to many others, to other truths waiting in the pockets of those who have yet to speak. The patience and careful observation I learned in that more became a fundamental weapon to overcome malevolence and keep moving forward. And so, as I write this and look at the crumpled paper I still keep, I realize that the true value is not only in what I discovered, but in the commitment not to let that small gesture, that unnoticed detail, be forgotten. Justice, I thought, is a long and dark path, but is the only light that can illuminate the cracks where truth hides. And although those cracks are small, they are the very hope that justice might one day prevail. The days continued dragging on with a slowness laden with tension and anticipation. I always walked with the feeling that someone was watching me, but that shared paranoia was not baseless. In every movement, in every conversation, I felt the invisible weight of eyes that never blinked and ears that never wandered. Every step I took seemed to tread on a minefield, not only because of the fragility of the case, but because it was clear that the network we were trying to unravel extended far beyond what I had initially imagined. The old crumpled paper remained in my pocket, almost like a silent amulet, reminding me that I could not falter, that patience was indispensable, and that truth was often found in details hidden to the naked eye. One afternoon, while reviewing the documentation alongside the prosecutor who had decided to bet on justice, we received the news that the digital files that held part of our evidence had been suddenly deleted. It was not a mere technical failure or oversight. It was a clear message. Someone with privileged access was dismantling our work to bury it forever. The helplessness I felt at that moment was brutal. But that same wave of inaction transformed into a strengthening of our resolve. If they wanted the case to disappear, they would have to do it over our dead bodies. We began to replicate and secure every piece of information, establishing discrete connections, changing the locations of our meetings, and watching each other. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. The city now seemed like a chessboard whose pieces moved with silent precision, not revealing their true intentions until the game was over. But I couldn't afford to be a pawn. I had to learn to move with cunning and quiet firmness. One early morning, when I was reviewing the file of the elderly man again, a detail jumped out at me, a marginal note that had gone unnoticed. It was an apparently encrypted code, a set of numbers and letters difficult to interpret, but it matched the classification system used by a company implicated in the case. That clue was a mathematical confirmation that the man had not only been a victim of poisoning, but had been involved in a silent fight against that company. A wave of gratitude and pain overwhelmed me. The old man had risked his life just to try to expose what so much power wanted to keep hidden. It was an act of bravery that now belonged to all of us. But we had not yet touched the true heart of the network. In a series of clandestine meetings, we received testimonies confirming the systematic use of toxic substances in agricultural areas, handled not only with indifference but with the intention of exterminating entire communities to facilitate the purchase of their lands. Amid whispers and tears, people revealed to us how their children suffer from unexplained illnesses, how local doctors had been intimidated not to document the real causes, and how bodies disappeared, camouflaged under false reports and official documents that shielded those responsible. Despair crept into their voices, but the presence of those testimonies was like a beacon, irrefutable proof that we were not dealing with isolated incidents but with perverse strategy. As the evidence grew, so did the pressures, like a storm approaching with unstoppable force. During a meeting with community representatives and activists, one of my colleagues was intercepted and attacked. The assault was not accidental. It was a brutal warning aimed at stopping us. At that moment, I felt a mix of rage and fear, but more than that, a crystal-clear decision. We were not going to back down. I then decided to strengthen communication with international organizations, to weave a wider network where local injustice would have global visibility and where the weight of public opinion could pressure those who resisted being unmasked. Working in Quito and making occasional visits to rural communities became a delicate balance. Every interview, every piece of evidence collected, brought us closer to truth, but also increased our vulnerabilities. I clearly remember a cold night in the highlands when a farmer handed me a notebook full of notes detailing dates, names, and the amount of herbicide sprayed on his land. That document was pure gold for the investigation, but also a deadly risk for him. As we said goodbye, I understood that this was not just legal or forensic work, but a humanitarian and political act with real consequences in the lives of those people. This made every time I returned to the morgue, the weight of commitment sit even heavier on my shoulders. On one occasion, an unexpected turn shook everything we thought we knew. The young prosecutor and I received an invitation to a meeting outside official channels, a secret encounter with an anonymous informant who claimed to have a recording directly implicating high-ranking officials in the cover-up of the case. Fear and distrust made us hesitate, but we understood that we could not afford to ignore any opportunity. That night, in a small, discreet cafe, we listened to the tape with a small group of collaborators. The voice emerging nervously from the recording was clear, articulating orders to manipulate evidence and divert investigations. It was definitive evidence of a dark pact protecting the powerful at the cost of the lives and dignity of many. However, disclosing that recording posed an immense risk. If we leaked that information without caution, we could endanger those working on the case and the very communities we had sworn to protect. That's why we began designing a well-thought-out strategy. First, we validated every detail, cross-checked testimonies and documents, and then planned a gradual information campaign that would not succumb under the avalanche of attacks and media manipulations. The idea was simple in appearance but complex in execution: to create an unstoppable wave of denunciation that forced legitimate authorities to act or be exposed under national and international scrutiny. During that process, the figure of the elderly man became a symbol of resistance for many. On social media, his image combined with the small, crumpled paper began circulating freely, accompanied by stories of those who had suffered the same or a similar fate. People began to feel that it was not just a legal cause, but a collective struggle, a cry that stirred up forgotten memories and walls, a reminder that human dignity is neither negotiable nor forgettable. I had learned that the power of a truth, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem at first glance, can incubate revolutions of hope if it is protected and multiplied with care. But darkness continued to lurk. The night the young prosecutor was violently attacked in a lonely alley, we knew we were touching very deep chords, and that the tentacles of power could strike mercilessly. The initial helplessness was harsh, but also reminded us that the road to justice is never linear or clean. Her slow recovery and rebirth as an even stronger voice within the prosecutor's office was an example for all. Nothing and no one could silence a desire for justice, even if the fight meant exposing oneself daily to real and constant danger. With that renewed impulse, we filed a formal complaint based on all the evidence collected. The first days were full of uncertainty as the judicial system showed contradictory signs. On one hand, official signals of openness. On the other, maneuvers to dilute the impact of our denunciations. We faced disinformation campaigns, setups to discredit our witnesses, and veiled threats directed at our families. Amid all that, I realized that the battle was not just against corrupt individuals, but against a power model that had normalized impunity and silenced the pain of so many. Then one unforgettable night, while reviewing the file one last time in my office, I received a call that changed everything. It was a trembling voice of a key witness who, after months in hiding, decided to step forward and reveal indispensable details. His account provided direct names, exact dates, and physical evidence that could not be ignored. For the first time, I felt that the puzzle was about to be completed, that the truth, the one hidden in a small, crumpled paper, was about to shine with all its strength. That moment was like illuminating a dark space that had been locked up for years. The air itself seemed cleaner, the pressure less unbearable. However, I also understood that this was not a victory, but a beginning. Justice would always be a winding road, full of obstacles and pains. But now we had a light that many had tried to extinguish. I was convinced that even though a single case cannot change everything overnight, opening that door was releasing the hope of so many other silenced lives. And as I held that crumpled paper between my fingers, I felt that beyond any threat or manipulation, patience, meticulous observation, and the courage of those who decided to speak were the most unstoppable force we have found. This battle was not mine alone, nor just the prosecutor's. It belonged to all who dare to face injustice head-on, to those who do not allow fear to become their prison. That is why, even though shadows remain there, lurking and trying to snuff out the flame. I know that no darkness is stronger than the brightness of truth upheld by those who fight, persist, and hope. And that truth, hidden in something as simple as a crumpled paper, is proof that justice can be born from the smallest details if there are those who seek it with patience, conviction, and courage. Since that call that shook my world, everything took on a new dimension. The witness, someone who had lived in the shadows for too long, emerged with a story that seemed ripped from a noir novel. But it was pure reality. His words were heavy, laden with contained fear and a truth he had never been able to share before. He told me about secret meetings where life or death decisions were made coldly, names of officials who appeared to be models of integrity, but manipulated the rules in the shadows to protect unsavory interests, hidden payments and threats that spread their influence like an invisible web, trapping those who thought they could defy it. Every detail he revealed fit with scattered fragments of the investigation, weaving a grim tapestry that showed the magnitude of corrupted power and the despair of the victims. From that moment, the palpable atmosphere around me grew even denser, as if the very air had become an agent controlling the temperature of my mood, pulling the rope between hope and anguish. The prosecutor and I worked with surgical precision to integrate the information, care for our witness, and ensure that testimony did not vanish into cracks of impunity. We hid him, protected his movements, and coordinated with specialized lawyers to shield his statement. But the price of these measures was high. Tension rose, familiar faces could be disguised enemies, and the nights grew longer and more cautious. Still, there was not a hint of doubt in our commitment. We knew that if that truth came to light, it would change the fate of more people than just the old man who had once appeared with a small piece of paper. Leaks began to appear in local media, first timidly, almost in whispers, then with a growing volume that could not be ignored. Communities that once seemed invisible began to demand, to organize, to tell their stories before cameras that seemed interested in listening for the first time. The figure of the old man became a symbol of resistance, not for traditional heroism, but for the humility that reflected the reality of those who fight day by day against systems that make them invisible, forget their voices, and try to erase their stories with indifference. In every square, in every assembly, the story of the crumpled paper reminded us that truth can be found where least expected, that a simple object can break old chains and open doors long closed. However, this growing visibility brought with it an alarming rise in violence. Attacks against activists became more frequent, and fear began to deeply settle among those who could barely protect their livelihoods. I remember a particularly dark night when I was called to attend a wake. A young peasant student and tireless activist had been murdered under circumstances they tried to disguise as an accident. But for us, it was clear that it was a message of terror. Despite everything, that tragedy did not extinguish the flame but fueled it, adding weight and urgency to our work. In that vigil, while the sound of prayers and sobs filled the space, I understood that the battle was not just about papers, figures, or reports. It was against a system that sacrificed lives and dignity to keep its privileges intact. Amid that chaos, the prosecutor was finally able to return, though with visible and deep wounds, both physical and emotional. Her comeback was an act of silent and powerful resistance. She carried not only the proof of the abuse she suffered, but the unbreakable conviction that nothing and no one could make her back down. Together, we reactivated the lines of investigation with renewed energy, connecting with independent journalists committed to telling the story with rigor and without fear. The dissemination strategy took careful but effective shape. We published verified data. Documentaries, interviews, and testimonies crossed paths to build a solid narrative that public opinion could neither ignore nor manipulate. The effect was a growing public outcry, pressure that began to crack the wall of silence, protecting the perpetrators. This process also exposed the deep wounds of our judicial and political system. A group of honest judges and prosecutors joined the cause, aware that their own reputation and morality were at stake. They worked behind the scenes to accelerate processes, issue arrest warrants, and protect those cooperating with justice. But every advance was met with spurious legal maneuvers and smear campaigns aimed at discrediting witnesses, spreading doubts about our integrity and causing wear. It was then that I understood that in this fight the enemy is not only found in blatant corruption, but also in disinformation, indifference, and social apathy, which so often allow injustices to continue under the shadow of normality. There was a particularly revealing moment for me, a night when, almost on the verge of exhaustion, I was reviewing one last set of documents in my office. The city seemed to sleep, but outside I felt a presence, as if something invisible was watching me. That was when I definitively realized that the small, crumpled paper had not only changed my perception of that case, but symbolized the very essence of what it means to be a forensic expert. The tireless search for truth, respect for the dignity of those who no longer have a voice, and the moral obligation of those left behind to tell what others kept silent. Those tiny details, seemingly insignificant, were the difference between justice and impunity. While holding that paper between my fingers, I thought of that old man, his silent struggle, and his unknown courage. That night I understood that he had not died in vain, that his legacy went beyond the walls of the morgue and legal documents, reaching the hearts of entire communities and awakening a society beginning to rouse from its slumber. My eyes wandered over a city that still slept, but whose night was sown with promises of change. The satisfaction was not complete. The battle was far from over, but the light that arose from that simple act, from the courage to observe, listen, and act with patience, was the engine that would fuel our work for a long time. And so, without fanfare or loud headlines, I understood that the true power of justice lies in those intimate and silent moments, in the quiet and firm resistance that build bridges in the dark. The paper, that small crumpled fragment, became an invisible key to a much larger puzzle, recovering lost dignity, giving voice back to those who were silenced, and reminding us all that from the simplest and most forgotten detail can arise a spark that ignites the fire of change. Justice, I learned, is not always a race against time, but a distance traveled with patience, truth, and courage, step by step, always forward.